Good evening, bonsoir. It's our Bible study, and tonight it's going to be a study in Christianity. I'm Joris Bürmann. I'm the curate at the French Church du Saint-Esprit, and it's always a pleasure to get together on Wednesday night to study the Bible or study the history of the Church and Christian spirituality. Welcome to this podcast, and if you want to leave a little message in the chat, say hi or interact, please feel free to do so, either during the live stream if you're watching us live, or after if you're watching the recording. So tonight we're going to have a look at All Saints' Day and also All Souls, the feast, the first few days that are coming up to us very soon, at the end of October and beginning of November. But let us start with a prayer, which is the collect for All Saints' Day in the Book of Common Prayer. Almighty God, you have knit together your elect in one communion and fellowship in the mystical body of your Son, Christ our Lord. Give us grace so to follow your blessed saints in all virtuous and godly living, that we may come to those ineffable joys that you have prepared for those who truly love you. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, in glory everlasting. Amen. So I suggest that we start this little study with, if you want, share in the chat who's your favorite saint, and you can share a little bit about them if you want. It's just a little question to break the ice. It's very difficult to choose for me. I have to say I've had a kind of a personal relationship with Thérèse of Lisieux, and she's supported me throughout my discernment in many Theresian ways, that is through a lot of flowers, but don't hesitate to share yours in the chat if you have any. Here are a few questions that we can keep in mind as we see. I see the Soldat 217 puts Bishop Paul Jones, and we have him coming up in one of our slides tonight. Wait until the end. Tonight we have a few questions that may help us think about what's the communion of saints. So keep them in mind as we go along tonight and see the history and the mystery and the history of All Saints. So the first one is, when you say in the Creed, I believe in the communion of saints, what do you mean by that? Well, we'll see some aspects of that, but maybe you can take this question for yourself. The second question is, how does the communion of saints shape your relationship with those who have died in Christ? We'll see also the relationship, ambiguous and old relationship between the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls. In what ways do you experience the communion of saints in your own worship and daily faith life? That's a good question, because not everybody actually relates to the saints. Many Christians don't think so much about the saints, especially if they're dead. The Protestants think, for instance, that whenever someone is dead, they're into the hands of the Almighty, and they're not always interceding for them. But you know, there are different ways in which people might relate to the saints, either alive or either on earth or in heaven. How does the idea of the communion of saints challenge your own individualism or sense of independence in faith? That's a good question. Who are the saints, past or present, who have strengthened your faith? It's a good one. Saints can be people who radiate with God's presence, can be on the calendar, cannot be on the calendar. Most saints are not on the calendar. There are only 365 days, I believe, a year, so it's not enough. The last question is, what might it mean for you to see the communion of saints as a missionary reality rather than only a mystical or communal one? I like this question because the best saints, all saints are good, but some really visionary points about certain saints have to do with the fact that communion and sainthood is about mission and spreading and communicating God's love beyond what the world think is valuable, what the world thinks worthy. So Thérèse of Lisieux is a very fascinating example of that, being both a Carmelite confined to a convent in Normandy and being the patron saint of mission and praying herself a lot during her lifetime, but also after, when she entered heaven, praying for missionaries and priests and all Christians. La Sainte Vierge Marie, bien sûr, the queen of the saints and martyrs. Alors, we're going to study tonight both the history and the mystery, as I said, of All Saints. And we'll try to explore, so don't hesitate to pop messages in the chat. I see the chat is already quite active. If you're on the metro or if you're at home, don't hesitate to leave a little message. And so we're going to explore the history and mystery of the feast. And let's start. Well, as you know, there are two kind of days that are sometimes conflated. In the Episcopal Church, we sometimes do it, on Sunday, for instance, at Saint-Esprit, we're going to commemorate both All Saints and All Souls. That's a possibility to move the Feast of All Saints to a Sunday when this feast is actually not a bank holiday. In France, for instance, or in some countries, historically Catholic countries, or actually some Lutheran countries as well, All Saints' Day is a holiday, but not in America, not in the United States. So we're doing it on the following Sunday because it's a major feast of the Church. So it's November 1st, and All Souls, that is the souls of all the departed, those that are not always publicly recognized by the Church as venerable, these are celebrated, and we'll see how it started, on November 2nd. These two feasts, November 1st and November 2nd, appeared at different periods, but are now intimately related through the liturgy, because you'll see that the liturgy kind of brings it together, and also through popular piety. Growing up in France, I can tell you that people think of All Saints, November 1st, but they think of going to the cemeteries, going to the grave, because the 2nd is not a public holiday, so people visit the graves of their beloved and wash them, put flowers. It's actually a very busy day in French cemeteries, November 1st, on the 1st, not on the 2nd. So you see the feasts have really been conflated in the understanding and life of people. And that's probably a very good thing, because we're talking about communion, not division, the communion of saints. It is a major Christian holiday in certain parts of the Church, especially, as I said, in Lutheran, Anglican, and Roman Catholic and Orthodox. We'll see they have a different date. But for a lot of the Church, basically most parts of the Church that are not strictly Protestant, Reformed, or Baptist, or Evangelical, this is an important feast. It's a quite beautiful modern painting called All Saints by the artist Elizabeth Wangs. I kind of like it because it's something extremely difficult to depict, the communion of saints. And this does has an attempt to do it. You see some with halos. One that's partly shiny here, maybe it's either Jesus or the Virgin Mary, and you have like the auras and the presence of God, definitely around here, and you have people on earth and in heaven. So I think it's trying to portray the reality that there are saints on earth and in heaven, and you're not quite sure who is on this side of the veil or who is on the other side. And I think that's what All Saints is about. And here you see there's even more beyond there that you can't even see. So let's look at the origins of All Saints. Well, like some very ancient feasts of the church, there are actually multiple birthplace for a celebration. For All Saints, like most ancient religious festivals, it originated in the east of the Mediterranean, that is the Greek part of the Roman Empire. In the 4th century, around the 4th century, you have a Feast of Martyrs that celebrated on different dates, close to Easter usually. On May the 13th, for instance, in Edessa, in Syria. So Edessa was a very important center of the early church, with very important church itself, the Syrian church, which gave a lot of church fathers, and who has its own very particular and interesting history. And also on a Friday after Easter in Nicodemia, which is in nowadays Turkey, north of Turkey, or the first Sunday after Pentecost in Constantinople. So you see there was a celebration of all the martyrs, of all the saints, usually after Easter, which in a sense makes sense. Because if you follow, for instance, the Gospel of Luke Acts, you see that there's the resurrection and then there is the sending out of the church. And that's really in the book of Acts where you see the first martyrs, the first the apostles going in the world and facing also persecution and facing their own mission. So it makes sense that you would have that at that moment, basically in the season of Pentecost or just after Easter. And in the Orthodox Church, it's still how All Saints are celebrated. Interestingly enough, people think that it would have moved also from the spring, basically, in the northern hemisphere, to the fall, because it kind of matched better with the Christian calendar. It helped balance it, because you would already have a lot of celebrations in the spring, in May, and so having something in the fall would work probably better if you want to calibrate it. That's probably somehow, it's not quite clear why, but in the Christian West, a feast for All Saints appeared a bit later, usually around the feast. It was the Feast of All Martyrs in Rome, and beginning in the 7th century, which was related to the dedication of the Church of Saint Mary of the Martyrs. That's a church that was basically created within the old pagan pantheon. The pantheon was this big temple, you see it here in Rome, and the pantheon was as I said, a polytheist temple dedicated to all the gods, and interestingly enough, it was turned from all the gods to all the martyrs, Saint Mary and all the martyrs. And if they actually moved the celebration of all the martyrs to this place, it's because around Rome you have there was a lot of cemeteries that are called catacombs, because sometimes they're underground cemeteries. And in these cemeteries, there used to be the remains of martyrs and saints, and people were partly, for instance, persecuted and killed during the persecutions of Diocletians or some early Christian communities. And when the troubles of the migrations and invasions, called sometimes barbarian invasions, happened in the 7th century, the Pope who was the main religious leader in Rome, decided to gather them together within the walls of Rome in the Pantheon. So that's how all the remains got put together in that Pantheon here in Rome. That's a very beautiful square. The Anglican Center in Rome is just like 300 meters away behind here. There's a very good cafe here as well. So it's not quite clear. As I said, you see in the East, and the first time in Rome, it appeared around the moment of the spring, basically linked to the dedication of a church. But for some reason, November 1st became an important date for the celebration of All Saints. It's said that in the 8th century, there was a Feast of All Saints in England on November 1st. And it's in 833 that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Louis the Pious, who was the son of Charlemagne, prescribed its celebration for the whole empire. And so that's really the first moment when you have the spread of the feast beyond Rome, I think, and beyond, pushed by a political leader as well. Here you see Louis the Pious. It's a contemporary depiction, actually, which is quite rare for that early, except on coins, of course, from 826. It's the emperor as a miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. And you have behind it a whole poem of Rabanus Maurus, and it's kept in the Vatican library. So why November 1st? Well, what you read online and what a lot of people say is that it's basically a Christianized version of a Celtic holiday. But it's somehow a problem because it appeared at the same time, or even just a bit earlier, in Rome, and Rome is no Celtic region. So people think rather that it's Pope Gregory III who built an oratory in St. Peter's Basilica in honor of all the saints and dedicated it on November the 1st. The date of dedication, of transfer of relics, is usually the dates the old church, the early church used to celebrate festivals, and then it took on from there because it was a big celebration, and the following year people would do it, and the year after, and then people will associate this celebration to the whole celebration and spread it beyond. And you know the influence of Rome in the early church. People went on pilgrimages to Rome and came back and said, well, in Rome they do it that way, they do it on that date. Why don't we do it that date? So there was kind of the latest fashion to follow Rome, of course, besides, of course, the influence of the Pope and the fact that there was a authority of the Pope in Rome. So the feast spread widely, actually in the 9th century, and by the time of Gregory IV, who was Pope at the beginning of the 9th century, the date was made really universal for the whole Latin Church, and it possibly in connection also with the efforts to unify Western Christianity throughout the Carolingian Empire, as we saw with Louis the Pious. So those worked hand in hand to have common celebrations. I mean, we see it in any contemporary nations. Why do nations actually have a national holiday? Well, it's to unite and gather the people together around one day, one moment of celebration. So that definitely plays a big and important role in living together the communion of saints on earth, to celebrate together with our brothers and sisters in heaven as well. So the celebration of All Saints was not at that time only martyrs, about martyrs, even if they still had a special importance, for instance, in the liturgy. And that festival gave rise also to a period of fasting, a vigil, the day before, that is the Vespers, the wake that you would have the day before, and that's why you have All Hallows Eve, the the eve of All Hallows, that is All Saints, on the 31st. It's really, I have to see it as a 3-day festival, kind of mimicking also the Triduum of Easter, the 3 days of Easter. It starts just like Easter, at night, and then you have the full day of the first and then the day of the second. So it's a Triduum of the Church. One way in which it spread, actually, I don't know if it's not on this slide. In the medieval period too, you see Saint Bernard leading Dante. It's an example because, of course, Dante, in his Magnus major work, he talks about the paradise and he meets some of the saints when he goes to paradise. Here he's led by Saint Bernard. And you see he met also Pope Gregory and other great saints of the church, or Thomas Aquinas. So there was a wider spread of the devotions around All Saints too at the time. So I've been talking about All Saints, but the reason why we think often, especially if you're not particularly religious or Christian, about All Saints, is that you think of the dead and you think of commemorating the dead and remembering the dead. That's something that's very present culturally in certain countries, like I can think of France, but also Mexico. People think of not only the saints of the church, but bringing and taking care and remembering the people who have died before them in their family. So it's interesting because this second feast that happened on the 2nd of October was a feast really created for the memory of all the departed. And it appears in the 10th century, and there was one powerhouse of Christian monasticism in the Christian West, who played a major role in the development and spread of the Christian spread of the Feast of All Souls and All Saints, as a matter. It's the Abbey of Cluny. Cluny is in Burgundy. It was a major new form of monasticism really at the time when it was founded, because it was a monastery that was not dependent on the local political power. It was directly dependent on the Pope. So it meant they had a lot of leeway to do a bit as they pleased. They, of course, had a lot of donors and everything, and one of the things they would do for their donors was also to pray for them. And that's the moment when the church started shaping also all of its theories about the afterlife, the purgatory, the fact that the dead need prayers, and one ways you can help the dead who needs your prayer is also to grant, basically to fund the prayers for the departed and for people who have given money, for instance, to build this beautiful monastery of Cluny, who was a masterpiece of the Romanesque architecture and then influenced the whole of the Western Church. Because Cluny, so Saint Odilon was abbot of Cluny, decided that a commemoration of all the departed will take place throughout all the monasteries of Cluny, the day just after All Saints, so on the 2nd of November. And so it started really with prayers for the donors, people who have given money, and for the monks who have died, who are part of the community. And still today, actually, if you visit monasteries, be it Holy Cross here in New York or the Society of St. John the Evangelist, the monks, especially at the end of the day, pray for members of their community who have passed. And so there's this idea of a sense of a monastic community that's also beyond death, through death, as we know in Christ. And so Cluny played a very important role in the spread of devotion around departed, of prayer for the dead, to help them in their afterlife, and to really, the monks of Cluny became famous and sought for advisors for the popes, but also for Christian leaders, who often allowed them to establish monasteries in their countries. So that's why there were more than 1,000 monasteries of the Cluniac order throughout the West that made this devotion very popular. And of course, it also matched with the piety of the time. That's a great period of transition for the West. To transition from a non-Christian culture to a deeply more Christian culture happened throughout the medieval period. It didn't happen just as Christian people were baptized in the first few centuries. So that's a moment where there was a big transfer of all the funeral rites, the funeral practices from things that were non-Christian to specifically Christian, and people related and started to see more and more their relation to their dead and to the afterlife through a Christian lens in terms of popular piety. So that's why there was a huge spread of devotions and prayers for the dead in that time. And it was a huge business for the churches too. As we see, that's what the reformers were very much against. There was a huge business, as we'll see, about relics, but also a huge business because you can pay buy masses to be said for the souls of your loved ones. So enough about that, but here you see the beautiful Abbey of Cluny. Unfortunately, there's not much left. Most of it was disbanded, was turned down in the French Revolution and sold. But when you go to Cluny, you can see actually this part, I don't know, one of the two side ones is still standing, and they did. I went there like 10 years ago, but they had a VR experience kind of thing, and you can see the nave actually, and they've probably improved it since then. But it was huge monastery, and it's actually quite close to where Thésée is today. It's a region where they make wine too, close to Mâcon. Anyway, that was the opulent medieval period here, and these very important monasteries that played a role in the spread of these devotions. But what happened, you might think then, of these traditions and these devotions and the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls throughout the Reformation era? Well, there was a huge reshaping at that time of how Christians understood death, how they understood sanctity, what they thought was communion too and remembrance, and they turned somehow their attention from doing intercessions for the soul in purgatory to being thankful for the faithful departed and really hoping in their eventual resurrection. But in a sense, for a lot of the reformers, and not only people who really moved and became Protestants, but there were also like Catholics who were very critical, and people who remained Catholics who were critical of what was called the excesses of certain forms of devotion and big business that was behind it, especially in terms of paying for the masses or the business of relics. So there was both a anthropological shift, but also a theological shift, and a re-understanding, a reconfiguration of what prayers was and what prayer meant, especially as it related to the dead and people who are in heaven. So for reformers like Luther, like Calvin, like Zwingli, they all rejected the idea of purgatory, that is this place where the souls would go before either going to hell or to heaven. And they also rejected the prayers for the dead. That is, they thought that since Jesus Christ had died for the people and that they had confided in Jesus. Jesus was their savior, and you didn't need to pray for them after they technically couldn't do anything to work out their salvation either. So there was no way you could basically pray for the dead to improve their situation. And that's the reason why All Souls Day was abolished in most Protestant regions. And not everywhere, but it also led, of course, to desecration of many churches, desecration of relics, and All Saints' Day was, as a matter of fact, also not observed as a Christian holiday. Here you see a altar retable by Jan van Arkel in Jan van Arkel Chapel in Utrecht Cathedral, the Domkerk, and it was found. This altarpiece was found in 1919 behind a false plaster wall during restoration work. So you see they whitewashed everything after the Reformation era, and they mashed it. That was during the big, what's called the Belden Storm, which was the big iconoclastic fever which happened in the Netherlands during the Reformation era. So you see, it's probably Mary surrounded by the apostles. Usually it's what it is here, and you see they've all had their face mashed. So in certain parts of the church, though, in the Lutherans, some Lutheran churches, most Lutheran churches, in the Anglican churches, as we'll see, All Saints' Day was sometimes kept as a commemoration of exemplary Christians, but was stripped of all intercessory prayers, that is, asking the saint to pray for you, or relic-related practices, which was something, that you would go to a shrine and you would pray, especially around the remains of the bodies of a saint. So what happened to the feast in the Anglican tradition? We're an Anglican church, so let's look a little bit into this. Well, it's interesting because, as you know, the Anglican tradition, the Episcopal Church being the Anglican Church in North America, Canada, there's the Anglican Church in Canada as well, but an expression of Anglicanism in North America. It's interesting to see how this feast has survived in the Anglican tradition, has also been reinterpreted, and we'll see there has been a lot of changes actually over the centuries. Well, Thomas Cranmer, who was one of the major actors of the composition of the Book of Common Prayer, is the one who really designed the Book of Worship and Liturgy of the Church, the Book of Common Prayer. He retained the date of All Saints' Day in the first Book of Common Prayer, but unlike other many medieval feasts that were suppressed. The 1949 collect already reflected actually Reformed theology, that is, a theology that didn't invoke the intercession or ask the intercession of the saints, but was more a prayer of thanksgiving for the saints' example and a call on God to help us be like them. And the focus at that time, and it's typical of the Reformation move and the Protestant move, was from one of veneration, that is, asking the saint to pray for you and ask to be shaped in the form of the saint, or have the saint intervene and help you out in your life, to one of imitation, that is, you look at the saint, you see how he lives out or she lives out a Christian life, and you ask God, not the saint, to imitate them. So the saints became really more of a moral and spiritual models of Christian life, rather than people you can ask for to pray for you. So the 1662 prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, continued the observance with a collect that was emphasizing gratitude, encouragement, and perseverance in holiness. That said, there were some places where some shrines have remained. Here you see the tomb of Bede the Venerable in Durham Anglican Cathedral. You see they even put a little cushion here, but that's the tomb, you see. There was a slow reintroduction of prayers for the departed, and also prayers to ask the intercession of the saints in the Anglican tradition. And this happened little by little. And as we saw, that they were removed some excluding intercession for the dead in the 1500s. But already in the 1700s, you had a group of people that we call the Caroline divines, and the Charles, the King Charles, and divine for theologian. Really, it's an old word that means theologian or man of God. And people like Lancelot Andrews, Jeremy Taylor, and John Cousin, they privately actually advocated for prayers for the faithful departed. And they framed them in a kind of via media, middle way, very Anglican, as an expression of hope in the resurrection, rather than really kind of praying for them to be released from purgatory. There was a kind of a new way that happened in the 1600s of thinking in the Anglican tradition what was the prayer for the dead and what was the intercession that you ask of the saints. But the major shift or like reintroduction of prayers to the saints and for the departed happened during what is called the Oxford movement, and all through the 1800s. That's this great period of revival within the Anglican Church, the Church of England, but also throughout missions throughout the world, and slightly later in America as well. A great period of revival of Catholic traditions within the Anglican communion. And the Oxford movement people and churchmen, because there were only men at the time, but there were also a lot of nuns. Actually, there were some Anglican orders of nuns, revived prayers for the dead as part of this whole restoration of the church continuity with ancient and Catholic tradition. They looked back, usually at specifically English rites and things like this, and try to revive a form of prayer to the dead, or looked sometimes towards Rome, to renew all souls observances. That could happen in parishes, that happened in cemeteries, that happens through processions. That was something that became widely popular in a period of also Romanticism, so people, that's the period when you have also the spread of Spiritism, of all the spiritualist movements, a fascination that the Victorians, people, the 1800s had to the dead, cemeteries. That's a moment where it was very fashionable also to go picnic in places like Greenwood in New York or other cemeteries. So I think that fitted quite well within the mindset of the people of the time. And these movements that were at the beginning at the margin of the church moved further within and became more widely accepted by the Anglican churches, which means that the 1928 proposed Book of Common Prayer in England and then the American 1928 Book of Common Prayer included already optional prayers for the departed. And by the mid-century, by the mid-1900s, there were commemorations of the faithful departed that were widely accepted within the Anglican liturgy and I would say throughout the Anglican communion. So there was it's a bit of a balance. There was kind of a backlash against certain practices because people realized that there was a tendency to make it dependent too much on the works and prayers of people in terms of the salvation of people who we can't see anymore. And then there was this reintegration of prayers, but reshaped also in the understanding, sometimes like with the Caroline divines, as prayers that are expression of hope in the resurrection of the people that you're entrusting in your prayers to God, whereas not just praying for them to be released from the flames of the purgatory. So the Episcopal Church, let's have a closer look of how All Saints and All Souls especially was handled within the Episcopal Church. So from its founding, the Episcopal Church was founded in 1789. The Episcopal Church retained All Saints' Day. That is on November the 1st. And on the first Book of Common Prayer, there was a principal feast that was All Saints' Day. I think there are a lot of messages in the chat. Je prie pour les morts, non pas parce que je pense que ça les aidera, mais parce que c'est une façon de leur montrer mon amour. Yeah, it's a beautiful way, I think, of relating to them. And I think that's closer to what the Caroline Divine had in mind. Show your love and also show you the relation through them to Christ, to the hope in resurrection, that you relate to them. They don't just disappear into a nihilistic void. They are very much present in different way, but they are. And to continue to relate to our loved one who we see no more is really to believe in our God who we don't always see directly as well. So there was a collect based on the English 1662 text in the Book of Common Prayer that gives thanks for the fellowship of the saints and asks for the grace to follow their example and share their joy. So you see, it was still keeping a lot of this Protestant, I would say, exemplary understanding and communion, but without intercession vision of what All Saints was. Here you see a lot of, I think it's kind of an interesting Episcopal board of saints here, because you have people who come from a lot of different religious traditions, Christian traditions, I mean. But the calendar of the Episcopal Church, like calendars of most Anglican churches, is not strictly denominational. That is, you might have people who are on the calendar of the Episcopal Church who are not themselves Anglicans or Episcopalians. I don't know if you can spot any on this. I think this is Pauli Murray. Is it Desmond Tutu? That's St. Francis for sure. That's Thérèse of Lisieux. I'm not quite good. Anyway, you can spot. Is it Sojourner Truth here? Might be. So there was a major update in the 1900s of all Western churches' liturgies. That is, the Roman Catholic went through a major update, and going back to the sources too. So it's both aggiornamento and ressourcement. And the Episcopal Church went through the same thing, thanks largely to the work of the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican II. Second Council, Vatican Council. So when the 1979 Book of Common Prayer was published, the Feast of All Saints saw its importance quite elevated, actually, compared to the former Book of Common Prayer. And it became one of the 7 principal feasts of the church year, and it also allowed it to be transferred to the following Sunday, called All Saints Sunday, in that occasion, for wider parish celebration. So you see that there was a insistent on this celebration. And all the readings emphasize the communion of saints. You have reading from Revelation, from 1 John 3, from Matthew 5, a reading from Luke this year, of course. And the 1979 US Book of Common Prayer explicitly also includes prayers for the dead in the Eucharist and in the burial rites, which was not something done in some earlier version of the Book of Common Prayer. So there was really this reclaiming of of all saints and the communion we also have with the departed, and prayers that we may address for the departed. Now you might wonder, praying for the dead, why? That's a question that a lot of people ask, especially if they come from more Protestant background, or if they just say, well, if you're Christian, why do you need to pray for people who are dead? Well, we've seen it already before. The reformers thought it was a form of distrusting in God's love and God's almighty judgment. And I have to say, today, I think for Episcopal Church, you don't always give a straightforward explanation, but you might point actually to the daily and secular tradition of like praying for the dead. That is, we all think of the people we know and see no more, we knew and see no more and love, and we might see also how their lives are intertwined with ours, and how their example, be them actually on the calendar of the saints or people we remember, have shaped our life and witness of Christ. And I think it's true to say that a society cannot live without the memory of its past. And families cannot forget their ancestors. People remember also their parents and who they love. And amongst the departed we pray for, many actually are in heaven, but we don't know. And they don't always have an official recognition of the church, which is, this official recognition is always for the church that we are part of, the church on earth, right? Because it's if people are singled out as being saints by the church on earth, it's because the church gains something from the frequentation, the spending time with their memory. And so there's definitely something powerful in relating to the dead, and not just, I would say, to Jesus Christ or to the saints from the Bible. There is a shaping, a communion, a community that we get, a flowing of God's blessings that has flown through the life of people before us, that we can tap into when we relate to the dead. And also for some people to pray for the dead helps them overcome resentment, overcome fear, or things that are not forgiven, that they have not forgiven, either to themselves because they've done something to someone, or because that person who passed away did something they reproached them, either because they were a loved one, or for instance took their life and they can't understand why this person did that, and so they might actually pray for them or talk to them. So it's not something, there's not a strict theological explanation for the reason why praying for the dead and praying with the saints is helps us become better embodiment of Christ in the world, but there's definitely something that's at work there. And that's what the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls reminds us of within the Christian calendar. So let's look a bit more into the mystery of the feast. Well, this feast gathers the memory and celebration of all the saints. So you both make the memory and the celebration of all the saints. As you remember their lives, but you also, it's not just a history lesson. I think that's what a very Protestant understanding of the feast misses out. It's also a experience. It's not just an intellectual kind of wordy learn from their example type of thing. It's also a communion. It's a celebration. It's realizing that we're part of the same one body, one baptism, one faith that Christ has provided for us. And so this feast also gives the opportunity that besides each saint's separate feast day, we have one common feast for all those who were transformed by Christ's grace. Because there are many saints, that of course have their own individual feast, but as I said, many don't. And it's important to realize that, when throughout the year we celebrate different saints, we actually celebrate them within the church. And this feast reminds us that all saints whose memory we celebrate, whose prayers we ask them because they are part of the church and because they are part of the body of Christ, not for their own merits, not for because they are an exceptional person in themselves. It's a feast that really reminds us that being a saint is always being in communion. So it's not merely a celebration of the saints that are forgotten or left out of the calendar, having got their own personal feast, but really the idea of celebrating together all of God's saints. And it's really the feast of the church. It's all the elects on earth and in heaven who join with their varied gift, with their varied graces, with their varied vocations into this one celebration. So it's more than just, I think that's something important to say, because sometimes what you hear people say that All Saints is for all the saints that are not, don't have their own feast day. Well, it's true, but it's not true, because it's more than just the sum of all the feast, saints' feasts. It's really a day within the Christian calendar when we're invited to think about the church expanse, how the church is beyond the community in which we are, that moment in time in which we are, and that's really inviting us to do that. Here you see 3 unknown saints. It's from a Ukrainian folk painting, I believe, from the 19th or beginning of the 20th century. They are known to us, I think, or to the museum, but they were probably known to the person. But that's what I chose to illustrate the point I was making here. It's quite beautiful, very joyful. So as I said, it's a feast of the church. The saints we celebrate are not merely a collection of individuals, and each one could not ignore their neighbor, and that's why we celebrate All Saints' Day. We're all members of one people of God and citizens of one city of God. And I think that's why it's so important to realize that we're created not for an individual success and honor, but to really fulfill God's unending vision. And really we're created to take a part in the immense and beautiful construction of the Church of God. And that's how you see that saints are really much different from heroes, because heroes rely on their own virtue, they rely on themselves, they're there to save someone, whereas saints are not your saviors. That's the major difference between saints and heroes. Saints are people who help you enter into communion. So that's why saints are sometimes compared to stones and living stones of God's church. And the gathering of these stones is not, as I said, just a mere heap, rambled stuff put together, but it's a church. And it means that, some stones are the foundations, and the apostles are sometimes called the foundations of the church. And then you, as what was this monk from Chartres, actually? Was it Alain de Chartres, who said, we are merely merely dwarfs sitting on the shoulder of giants, but because we are sitting on their shoulders, we can see further than they do. And that's very much what our relations to the saints is about too. We can rely on people whose life have come before us for their insight, for their prayers, for their struggles too, and see how they lived through their struggles and carried their cross. And there's things that really help us in our time become ourselves a dwelling place for the glory of God. And that's what all the church does. All the lives of the saints does. They make a dwelling for the glory of God. And the Feast of All Saints is like the dedication somehow of a living church, the church of the people of God. And that's why I chose this beautiful portal from Metz Cathedral. Metz is in the east of France. It's the Portal of the Virgin. It's 13th century Gothic. And from left to right, you have actually multiple saints. You have Saint Clement, Saint Gregory, Saint Helena with the cross. She's mother of the emperor and famous because she would have found the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. Saint Stephen here, martyr, and Saint Cecilia, the famous singer, patron saint of singers. And you see that on medieval cathedrals. The saints in the portal are not only the ones who welcome you within the communion of the church. They kind of really like are make an alley for you to enter the church. But they also are just living stones. The living stones, as their statues are here, almost holding the church. It's really powerful, I find. I've always loved that things that whenever you come to a Gothic cathedral, the first thing you see on the facade, it's people. You encounter faces. You encounter the faces of the saints, of people who have come before you. You're not faced with a billboard, or you're not faced with, a statement. You're faced with human, embodied shrines of God's presence. That's something that I find churches can, if I were to build a church, I would definitely like this. I find it's a really beautiful thing to be greeted by statues of saints. So voilà. So, as I mentioned, for us Christian, contrary to, for instance, when you think of heroes, there's a huge relativity of holiness. That is, not that it's relative and it doesn't matter, but that it's relational. That is, the Feast of All Saints shows us that whole holiness, whole sanctity is relational. It's something that you receive and that you communicate and you get shaped into, and that you receive also through patterning your life on the life of Christ. What saints have done in different aspects of their life. And the Feast of All Saints really shows us the complementarity of all the lives of the saints, of all the saints, all the people who built either the church that we see today, the church, it can be your local parish. People have different gifts, and it's the same thing for the universal church. Each saint is able to embody Christ only partially. That's why they're not our saviors. But each find his or her fulfillment only thanks to others and in relation with others as well. And that's how it's really important for us to relate to the saints. And the beauty of the saints is only an aspect and a part of the beauty and holiness of the whole church, of the beauty of Christ. And that's something that's extremely comforting, I find, especially when you think of how lonely people feel in very busy cities, sometimes like New York. To remember that we have this huge and beautiful community of saints around us and with us at all times, in all places, throughout all moments of our lives is extremely comforting. If you have a beautiful icon here of Jesus Christ in the middle here, and you see all the company of the saints around it. Here you see the bosom of Abraham. This little person, it's an image of paradise. So what church do we celebrate then at All Saints? Where we celebrate, as I said, an unbounded mystery. That's something. All Saints is quite humbling in itself, because we realize that both humbling and an extraordinary experience of thanksgiving, because we realize that we can't count how many people God has touched, and how many people He also has ready for our support on earth or in heaven. And so the church gathers all the saints, known and unknown to the wider church in this festival, and even people who have had tense relationship with the church of their time. And God knows that the church has not recognized saints, people that the church later recognized as a saint. Like you can think of Joan of Arc, for instance, who was condemned with the blessing of religious authorities, and later recognized as a saint. But the church that we celebrate at All Saints is a church that's made of people from all nations, all tribes, all people, all dialects, very much like the church you see described in the book of the Revelation of John, St. John the Divine. It's a church also that's made of all confessions. In the church heavenly All Saints that we celebrate, they are not only people who were during their lifetime openly Christians, and definitely from different denominations, but I think it's an important thing to say that people who we call on at All Saints were not all Christian. God recognized his own. And surely that's something, of course, the medieval church thought through, especially when it came to the Greek philosophers and people they admire, but who were not Christians, like Aristotle. There were some people who were like, how come Aristotle or Plato are not in heaven? Well, they are. And so it's a feast when we celebrate all those who look for God with righteousness and are there in the company of all the saints, even if during their lifetime they have ignored each other or if they have opposed each other. And I think it's also a beautiful vision to join in the company of all saints, because it reminds us that heaven is not partisan, that heaven is not confessional, that heaven is not denominational, that heaven is not national. It's a lot of things that we need to hear again and again, that the church on which we are to pattern our life, that lives from Jesus Christ himself, who is the light of the city of God, the Lamb. This church is unlike any form of community we know today. Even what we see as the militant, the active church on earth. It's a pale likeness of the actual mystical church. And I think that's also part of one of the reasons why the Feast of All Saints is at the end of the liturgical year in the West. Because that's the moment when we kind of count everything, all the blessings that we've had. That's something you might do in the morning, count your blessing, or in the evening. But at the end of the liturgical year, we kind of like harvesting with All Saints all the lives that Christ has transformed and transfigured and resurrected. And that's why it comes at the end here of the liturgical year, just before beginning of Advent. Basically, we have Christ the King that will really conclude. But there's this kind of season throughout the months of November. It starts with All Saints and ends with Christ the King, which is a mystical remembrance of the incompassibility of the church, the fact that the church is totally beyond what we usually understand. And at the same time, extremely intimate and close to us. And so it's the end of ordinary Sundays that marks the growth of the church. And the growth of the church is in green. It's the liturgical color for the ordinary time. So this Feast of All Saints, and at the end of November, the Feast of Christ the King, is really triumphal achievement of all of God's purpose, the achievement of Christ's salvation, of the history of the church, of Christ's presence through time, It's a beautiful celebration and a moment to remember all of this. And it points also when time moves in eternity, and it foreshadows the eternal feast of worship that we all will take part in eternity, in the presence of Christ, where all tears will be dried up. The source of tears will be dried up. So it takes a lot of different form in popular culture, as you know. After we've looked at the mystery, I'm going to look at different forms of popular expressions of it. It sometimes a manifestation of the veneration of the dead, which is, of course, common to all religions, I would say. And it's an affirmation of hope, which is more or less conscious of a certain survival of the soul, at least in the memory of the living. That's what, Halloween is about, for instance. In Catholic countries, All Saints and Feast of All Departed as a kind of important cultural dimension to it. It usually happens in the cemeteries, but you see also in places like France that secularization tends to empty the cemeteries on the 1st of November. But there are other places in the world where it has a very communal expression, the celebration of All Saints and All Souls, for instance in Mexico with Dia de los Muertos, or the ritual called Chubac, which takes place in a certain part of Mexico, in Campeche, during the Day of the Dead. And that's a moment when people actually clean the bones of their ancestors and put them in a new shroud in a box. Here you see the man cleaned up, which is something you see in other cultures as well. It's a moment you see of intimacy also with the dead. It's a physical intimacy, which we don't all do, but you can. There's a moment also of spiritual intimacy with the dead, and with the dead or the more than living, as Lita Basset, a French Swiss pastor and theologian, calls them, the more than living. So Halloween itself is a modern invention. But what it's been doing is that it happens. So it's called All Hallows Eve, and it's on the eve, the vigil of the Feast of All Saints. And today, Halloween is really a festival that has taken on its own life, kind of a secularized form of the celebration of All Saints, because especially in Protestant countries, it's linked to the supernatural. It's linked to not Christian mysteries or the relation of hope that you have within the church, but to a moment of thrill, of spookiness, in many different ways. Some Christians are very uncomfortable with it, of course, because they see the celebrations around Halloween, as you can see on this poster, as a celebration of the works of the devil. But I think there are different ways in which you can look at it. Of course, it depends how you relate to it, because there's this very old Christian tradition of carnival as well that exists and has existed and was supported by church authorities for the longest time. And I would say that Halloween is a form of carnival for our society today, a society that's extremely afraid of death and doesn't really know how to handle it, or things that it doesn't handle, or the supernatural, because our secular society tends to equate what it doesn't understand with what is supernatural. And Halloween is a moment, especially I would say for children, to kind of familiarize yourself with death in a way that's not scary, that's actually playful. It can be a way of taming death, or scary things through play or through costumes, or so it may have actually an evangelical, like, positive meaning, or it can be a parody of the demons if you go this way. It's a parody of all the things, a subversion of the devil's tricks, of all the things that the devil uses to scare us. So I think there can be different readings of Halloween. Of course, it's also, unfortunately, a period of time where there are moments of desecration of Christian sanctuaries and things like this. But there's possibly a positive way of engaging with Halloween, and I'm not sure we have to oppose them altogether. And despite the fact that, of course, the big commercial and capitalist reality of Halloween turns the celebration of All Saints and All Souls into a show of the paranormal. But I don't think in places like the United States, it's never been, except if you were in like very Catholic parts of the country, like Louisiana, I don't think that All Saints or All Souls has ever been a cultural reality for the masses. So it might be a strange way in which the All Saints is coming back into America through Halloween. It's the major difference that we can see, of course, between Halloween, which is a modern invention, which was, some people link it back to the Celtic Samhain tradition, but it's not traceable back there. Actually, it's really a folklorist invention of the 1800s and the 20th century, and it was spread widely in America by immigrants from the British Isles. The thing that has disturbed some Christians is the fact that when you move from Halloween, All Saints and All Souls to Halloween, you move from a feast, a Christian feast, that's about celebrating real things, that's about celebrating supportive relations, that's about celebrating courage, that's about celebrating the communion that we have through death with Christ and with all and with everything, to a thrill and the experience of the extraordinary and fiction, because that's what these stories are about. And I've never read anything about it, but it struck me that that the rise of the supernatural, you think of the Gothic supernatural, corresponded very much to the rise of secularization. The Gothic in Germany and in England, it started in late 1700s, Frankenstein and all these stories are scary because they're hopeless. There is no God in them. Yesterday I watched Hocus Pocus, and that's the fascinating thing about, these poor children who are facing the witches, is that they have no God to pray to get rid of the witches. They're left to vie for themselves in face of evil. And I think that's the danger, if you want, with Halloween or with secularization in a way. As Christians, that's what we believe, that it's a form of hopelessness. That's sad, because we do have that said, do we have to actually push back and say, be puritanical about it and say you should not celebrate Halloween, it's a devil's thing? Well, I'm not quite sure. It's ambivalent, I know some evangelical Christians, for instance, don't like to celebrate Halloween and wouldn't do trick-or-treats and would not let their children dress as they want to dress and will have to be dressed as Saint Cecilia or some other famous saint, which I'm not sure is actually more comforting for the child if she has to have her throat cut off. But you see, it's ambiguous. I have no answer about that. That's why I put this poster. But you might have very interesting opinion about the topic. I found this quote from the former Archbishop of Brussels, who was a well-respected cardinal, Cardinal Daniels, who I think is quite interesting because he comments on the secularization of Christian holidays and what it does to the faith. He said, it was in French, "It is striking to observe how, almost imperceptibly, our society has shifted from the real to the imaginary. Christmas becomes Santa Claus." And he developed in All Saints, and I just summarized, All Saints becomes Halloween. And it becomes more troubling when we realize what we have lost. In place of an invisible world that was authentic and real, we content ourselves with an imaginary, invisible world of our own making. The consolation that once came from elsewhere, from God or from the saints, and was true, we now draw from within ourselves, a kind of self-consolation. Self-consolation, or actually self-despair in the case of Halloween. Well, that's all I had for All Saints and Halloween as a whole. But if you have any comment, don't hesitate. I see the chat has been very lively. It's good on this celebration of All Saints and the departed, the feast of the blessed departed. I see there was one. Pourrait-on dire que les saints sur terre et au ciel sont des personnes qui vivent les béatitudes? Yes, actually, the gospel reading for Sunday, the Beatitudes. People who live the life of Christ and our pattern on his, for sure. Je pense que lorsque nous mourrons, non seulement nos péchés sont pardonnés, mais même nos vertus sont consumées. Nous dépendons entièrement de la miséricorde et de l'amour de Jésus. That's a very beautiful thing that you say here. I think that even when we die, not only our sins are forgiven, but even our virtues are consumed. We depend fully on the mercy and love of Jesus. Thérèse of Lisieux has beautiful poems about that. She says something like, I know that all our virtues are but... she say, I can't remember it now. When I think in English, I can't think in French. But yeah, she has beautiful poems when she talks about it. All our virtues are but a drop in everything we do. She has also a beautiful poem that's called If I Had Committed All the Sins. C'est vrai, mais chacun et chacune de nous ont vécu et survécu un aspect de la souffrance et de la joie de Jésus qui contribuera sans doute, bien sûr, à la plénitude. That's what, yes. Yeah, I mean, that's what Jesus says when he leaves his disciples. You'll do greater things than me. Nous aime si profondément qu'il ne peut pas se passer de nous. Nous sommes son investissement. We are in his investment. He cannot do without us. Yes, it's very Meister Eckhart-ish here, Nigel. God depends on us. Bondori is a Japanese group of folk dancing in honor memoriam of the ancestors and departed loved ones. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if they're in the Christian tradition of dancing with the dead. I know the cleaning of the graves happens in certain Christian rituals. And we do it. We did it at Saint-Esprit. But also having meals, definitely having meals next to the tomb of the departed is something that was important in the early church in terms of like the catacombs and everything. But also in certain cultures, people had picnics on the grave of their departed. Even in Victorian era, it was something common. Boom. Well, I have a little treat for the end. I don't know if Mark is watching, but I thought since we're talking about All Saints, we can also talk about Bishop Paul Jones. Just a little 2 slides about Bishop Paul Jones. We were extremely humbled and honored to receive a gift from Mark, a member of our congregation online. I don't know if you've ever been, Mark, if you're watching at Saint-Esprit in person recently. But anyway, Mark is the grandson of Bishop Paul Jones, a bishop in the Episcopal Church. And Mark gave us some of the papers, the personal papers of Bishop Paul Jones, some of his notes during, I think, some conference he attended in Europe in the 1930s. Very interesting because he took note about the very terrible political situation in Europe in the 30s with all the wars, the displaced, the Jewish refugees who tried to take refuge in other parts of Europe because of the racist laws in Germany and the xenophobic laws as well against foreigners. And so, and there's also other papers I'll show you. So I just want to summarize quickly, tell you a little bit about the life of Bishop Paul Jones. We'll show on All Saints, I think, some of his papers in the church, and for you to look at if you come in person. But Bishop Paul Jones was Bishop of Utah, actually during the First World War. But when the American army decided to join, and the United States decided to join the war, he publicly opposed and refused this joining the U.S. involvement in World War One, so much so that his fellow bishops, as far as I've understood, I've not read a full history of his life, but forced him to resign. So the Episcopal Church forced him to resign, basically his episcopate as a diocesan bishop. So that was the pressure from the House of Bishop that pushed him out of his see as a diocesan bishop. Of course, he was ordained a bishop, so they couldn't deconsecrate him, but he went on to take different positions as kind of assisting bishops and other things. But this situation was really a blow to his career, but also one of great Christian witness, because Jesus never said to go out on war, especially World War I would say. There was really a war of imperialism. But for his stance, he is remembered by the Church as a prophet of peace and also a witness of conscience, how you can stand for what the Holy Spirit tells you to be right, even against the political power of your time and the religious powers of your time, especially the religious institutions. So that's a very important example of Christian life. I was reading, it was a very fascinating thing. Between the two world wars, he was also involved in Salt Lake City during the First World War, actually, but also after, with German immigrants. German immigrants were imprisoned, just like the Japanese during the Second World War, and the Germans too, I think. But Japanese during the Second World War were imprisoned because they were potential interior enemies, and because the Germans were also potential interior enemies. Some of them were detained in camps, basically, and he advocated for them. He advocated for, against all of these imperial nationalist powers that have destroyed Europe and the world over the last two world wars, but also are still destroying our world today. And so he went on, despite his resignation as Bishop of Utah. He went on later to found a Fellowship of Reconciliation in the US and advocated for peace and reconciliation, very much grounded in his Christian faith, and very much just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom he met. Actually, Mark told us that he met Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Sweden, Bishop Paul Jones. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who meditated a lot on the Beatitudes. And in his prison papers and in his later texts, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about how the church should be refounded around the Beatitudes. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself was a great example of Christian conscience in a time when the church and his country was being totally decrepit and Christless. So Bishop Paul Jones continued ministry amongst his students and pacifist communities until his death. And he spearheaded also what became Episcopal Relief and Development. And I was told by someone who works there actually that Episcopal Relief and Development has a special employee award named the Bishop Paul Jones Award. So his legacy is still alive in the Episcopal Church, and he's remembered in the Episcopal Church Lesser Feast and Fast on September 4th, and is honored also as a witness of conscience, peace, and the prophetic gospel. Here are some of the papers that were bequeathed to Saint-Esprit that will go on the new calendar of our calendar and the new catalog of our archives that's being done at the moment by the archivist. And here is a copy that he made himself, Bishop Paul Jones, I believe, of his last speech in Utah. You see, it signs Bishop of Utah, probably with his signature above, where he was pushed to the line, basically. And it's very poignant. Apparently, he wept as he said it, as he read it. I'll read it for you. And I think this story reminds the church that sainthood can mean standing for peace, even when it costs dearly to the saints who have to do it, and that it also reminds us that saints are not always recognized as saints in their own time. So here I'll finish by reading this farewell address of Bishop Paul Jones. I regret the necessity for taking leave of the many friends throughout the district whose loyal service has made the work successful. He's talking about his work in Utah. But after all, where I serve the church is of small importance, so long as I can make my life count in the cause of Christ. I am more concerned at the remarkable conclusions expressed by the Commission of the House of Bishops, which I think must call forth vigorous protests from people who love the Church, no matter what their attitude on the war question may be. Expediency may make necessary the resignation of a bishop at this time, but no expediency can ever justify the degradation of the ideals of the episcopate, which these conclusions seem to involve. In the earnest hope that the future of the District of Utah may be rich in service and achievement, I bid you Godspeed. Voila, that's all that I had for tonight. I thought it would be shorter than usual, but I see it's already 8. I'm sorry. I hope you, if you have any, I saw the chat was very lively, that's lovely. But if you want to join us and continue the discussion live, there is the Zoom link that you've received in your email, and we can talk a bit more about All Saints and All Souls. So, if not, see you next week, and have a good celebration of All Saints and Feast of All Souls. And God bless you. Dieu vous garde. Bye bye. See you.